Good morning and welcome to our latest Life Sciences Legal Forum. This morning, we're going to focus on clinical trial contracting, specific from the optics of the drug sponsor. Um, we do this work quite a bit. So we advise a number of therapeutic clients across all different phases, and we thought it was probably useful just to try to sort of pull that together and distill that in terms of some of the key contracting trends, key issues that we are seeing. There'll be plenty of time, hopefully towards the end, for people to raise questions, and you can do that through the Q&A function on Zoom. I think the plan today will be to sort of talk through some of those key issues as we are seeing them, and obviously just focusing on medicine's clinical trials. Um, uh, I'm delighted to be joined by two of my senior colleagues who will sort of intro themselves as we get into the discussion. Stephanie Caird and Isabel Tier. Just to provide a bit of, I suppose, context before we start. Hopefully, it'll become clear from when we sort of start to talk through this that the planning is absolutely key. Clinical trial contracting is pretty complex in terms of when we start to sort of talk around the sort of the different sort of layers and types of contracts that need to be put in place, the regulatory angles as well. And I suppose just a few points to note. As many of you'd be aware, the clinical trial regime is currently under consultation within the UK. We're currently in a position whereby there is divergence with the European Union, where the clinical trial regulations have been adopted. Although the law and regulations we have in the UK are obviously sort of based on the directive and based on a lot of the EU principles, and so EU guidance is going to be relevant as well when we're looking at some of these issues. The other point to note is different rules will apply for different kinds of studies and different kinds of products, and we'll jump into some of that as we go through. I think we're going to be looking specifically at studies that have been initiated by a drug sponsor, so by a pharmaceutical company. But if anyone has any sort of specific questions they want us to sort of look at in terms of other kinds of studies, then we can look at that. So clinical investigations and the like. I think often one of the key issues is almost sort of stepping back and thinking around the overall jigsaw. So when we're looking at contracting with a particular service provider, where does this sort of sit in the whole context of the clinical trial project? I'll ask my colleagues to sort of talk through sort of contractual setup in a bit, but obviously there are different groups of contracts, different layers of contracts. So you're often having to sort of think through sort of the interdependencies between contracts, thinking about the dependence of particular service providers and whether there's a need to think around portability of contracts to new providers as the trial gets going. In the context of clinical trials, obviously we're looking at or we need to be cognizant of the overarching principles, which is sacrosanct in relation to clinical trials. So around transparency, rules around transparency, rules around safety of the trials, and I'm sure we'll get into a number of those issues as we talk through this morning. We're obviously looking at different phases, potentially a phase 1 single study trial up to sort of very large phase 3 trials across multiple sites with large patient cohorts. And obviously there's some complexity builds as you go through the individual phases. I think the other thing that needs to be thought about in the context of clinical trial is the other rules and regulations that may apply. So particularly around things like patient consent, privacy issues, and we'll talk about all of this. In the context of clinical trials as well, it's quite definition heavy, and we'll get into this in terms of definitions of clinical trials, which are directed to interventional human studies, the importance of the protocol, and all the different actors in relation to the drug sponsor, and ensuring that they have oversight in relation to their regulatory responsibilities, investigator, trial sites, the CRO, the data, the trial subjects, and just ensuring and thinking around the overarching governance of the trial as well. So perhaps if I turn to Isabel first of all. So Isabel's a sort of senior regulatory lawyer in our life sciences team, and I suppose the question to pose to you, Isabel, is to sort of think about, well, what are those key things to be considering from a regulatory perspective at the outset of the trial, and also to think about sort of how does the regulatory framework then impact contracting setup.
Well, clearly that this is a heavily regulated and complex field, and not only do you have complex regulations that vary from one jurisdiction to another. So, as James has mentioned, we've got the EU with its new clinical trials regulation. The UK is reforming its regulations, moving slightly different direction. Different parts of the world, other regimes. So you've got a great deal of complexity, and it's also changing, but there are some core principles that will apply quite broadly. Essentially, you have the role of sponsor, who takes the lead in managing the clinical trial. It's the individual or company or institution, etc., which takes responsibility for initiation, management, and/or financing, and that organization, there could be two, there could be co-sponsors, but the ultimate responsibility for all these regulatory matters will, in the clinical trial for an investigational medicinal product, rest with that sponsor. And so what the sponsor will need to do at the outset is map out where all of those responsibilities that involved in carrying out the clinical trial will sit. Often it won't be able to do all of those things itself, especially if you've got a smaller organization to begin with. And so getting in place relationships with the different entities that will be involved, and then being clear about which responsibilities sit where, it is one of the things that you're looking to do in that contractual framework. You want to be very clear. It's in fact an obligation in many regimes, notably the EU regime, that you have to specify contractually where those responsibilities will sit, so that there's complete clarity. What the regulator wants to do is make sure that there's nothing going to be falling between the gaps. So if you are clear about who takes which set of responsibilities, then that helps to satisfy those regulatory obligations. But always remembering that the sponsor will retain overall responsibility and will need to be able to check on how all of those tasks are being carried out and audit and so forth. So we've got the GXP regimes that will be relevant in a clinical trial. You're looking at primarily it's the good clinical practice regime, which there are internationally developed principles whereby the various obligations of proper conduct of a clinical trial are set out in detail. So all of those things around appointing your investigators, recruiting participants, gaining their consent appropriately, the quality of the investigational medicinal product, all of those safety reporting systems, and data governance, whereby you gather all of the information and make it available at the end for the purposes of gaining marketing authorization. So you've got good manufacturing practice and good distribution practice. They will also come into play for the production of the investigational medicinal product, and then good laboratory practice for the testing and making sure that the quality is appropriate. So those different sets of regimes will need to be fulfilled, and clearly you'll want to allocate, for example, the manufacturing aspects, allocate those to a specialist manufacturing entity, and allocate the responsibility for ensuring that's carried out appropriately to that body that you are asking to carry out the manufacturing work. So we see, alongside the contract for the manufacturing to take place, for example, you will need a quality agreement which sets out how those obligations will be allocated as between you and who is to carry out which of them. And then as a separate area that I wanted to mention is the legal representative role. Now, this comes up in certain jurisdictions, notably EU and the UK. They will require a local representative in defined circumstances. So for the EU, it will be if there is if the sponsor is not established in the EU, then an EU legal representative will be required. They will act as the sponsor's representative locally and liaise with the regulatory authorities in the EU. And a notable change under the new EU clinical trials regulation is around extending those responsibilities, so that rather than just a sort of post box type role, the EU legal representative now has additional tasks and has to ensure that the clinical trials regulation will be fulfilled. In the UK, it's slightly different because if there's an EEA based sponsor, then you don't then require a UK entity. There's a list of countries, in fact, that's set out that's satisfactory for a representation, and EEA countries are included in that. But again, it may be necessary to appoint a legal representative if you're not a UK or EEA entity. So just very broadly speaking, those are the key areas of regulation that I wanted to mention at the outset.
So it's really getting an understanding of those key regulatory responsibilities as the sponsor in the context of the trial, work out, as you said, sort of mapping across the contractual framework in terms of the delegation of that responsibility down to the trial partners, understanding the broader context in relation to GXP in particular, and then thinking around those additional requirements that will depend on your own group structure, group operations, as to whether you need, for example, legal rep or other arrangement in the jurisdiction in question. So that's really useful. Maybe if I just turn to Steph, just to maybe start to talk around I talked about layering, Steph, and sort of grouping of contracts, and maybe it's useful just sort of to talk about all the additional contracts that may be required in the context of a trial. And I may ask Isabel just to come back in and talk about some of the regulatory agreements as well. But Steph.
Yeah. Thank you. So Isabel's obviously already mentioned the manufacturing agreement that might have a quality agreement sitting alongside it, but fundamentally you usually have at the very top of the chain a contract between the sponsor and a CRO, a contract research organisation. They are companies that specialise in helping managing studies. You can have generalist CROs, or you can have some fairly specialist ones that work in particular disease areas as their specialism. So what you tend to have is a master services agreement with that CRO that then allows you to enter into separate project agreements with them for either different phases of your studies, or if you have multiple different jurisdictions, you could have work orders on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis if you wanted to. And in that CRO agreement, you agree with them what services that they will be providing, what services are available, and mainly that will be managing of clinical trials, interacting with sites and other vendors in order to help things run seamlessly. With the sites, which is the kind of active part of your trial, you can either enter into site agreements via your CRO, so you give a power of attorney to your CRO to execute those on your behalf, or you enter into those directly with the site yourself, but manage the negotiation via your CRO. A lot of the site agreements will be based on standard templates. So, for example, in the UK, we have the IRAS model templates that are templates that have been developed between the NHS and industry and are generally required to be used without amendment. And other jurisdictions have similar approaches. Spain, for example, they have one on a kind of legal area basis. So Madrid and Barcelona will have different templates. France, they have a centralized one where the French version is the ultimate version, but you have an English translation that you can review. Aside from those two key contracts, so your CRO and your site contracts, you will also usually have to think about your manufacturing of your investigational medicinal product and the quality agreement that sits alongside it. Then you might need to think about how that gets to your sites and distribution practices. Sometimes a CRO will organise that all on your behalf. Sometimes they don't want to get involved with that in case something goes wrong with the transport and then your drug product is damaged. Other things that might be involved are if you need to have an evaluation of test samples, you might either have a central laboratory where your samples get sent to for evaluation, or you might have multiple different laboratories that will do the evaluation for you. Those might either be part of your site arrangement or central. You also might need to have a database provider that you upload your clinical data into, that you get your sites to do the case report forms and upload them onto the database. So you might have a separate agreement for that, and that will be both a service contract, and you might need to think about data protection implications as well. So if you have cross-border transfers of data, you might also have an international data transfer arrangement that you need to put in place. With all of those things, you will need to think about the interplay between the network of contracts and where you're allocating the risks, because ultimately as a sponsor you remain on the hook for ensuring that your trial is safe, and patient safety and transparency, and vendors are not going to want to take on a disproportionate amount of risk to what they're being paid, and that can quite often be a bit fiddly. But I won't anticipate some of the things that James and I would want to talk about in terms of themes and trends that we're seeing in that contracting. But that's kind of the general structure. You have your CRO, you have your sites, and then you have a web of different vendors, and either the CRO contracts with all of them on your behalf, or some of them might be directly with you. For example, if you like a laboratory, you might be using them for your evaluation and storage of samples.
And your protocol will be a sort of a guiding document in that regard,
Yeah.
just Steph, in terms of understanding all those flows and interplays. And it's obviously a contractual document. It's gone through all the necessary approvals. I think that is quite often your guiding document in terms of actually sort of how you're going to deal with the interplay between all the different actors in the context of the trial.
Yeah.
Could you say something
Could I-
US, sorry, US CTAGs, and I think you talked about a lot of the European
Yeah.
forms of CTAG and when it's mandated or not. The US is quite different in terms of approach. Could you just say a few words maybe about the US?
The US can be a bit quirky. So that they do have and it's called an ACTA, an Accelerated Clinical Trial Agreement. So you can use that as your base document to start negotiations. But what I have found in the US clinical trials is that a lot of sites will have their own templates that they like using. There will be some quirks if you're dealing with kind of government or academic institutions, particularly when you start talking to them about data privacy issues, because the US obviously has the HIPAA regime. Different states in the US also have their own data protection laws. So California, I think Florida, both have Data Protection Act equivalents, where personal data definitions don't necessarily line up with what we have here. And the IP provisions can also sometimes be a little bit challenging, particularly if you're dealing with the kind of large university hospital type organizations, because they will want to try to have rights to IP that is developed within their hospital. So my kind of health warning would be, if you're dealing with the US, just factor in some time to iron out some of those wrinkles, particularly on IP and data privacy issues.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to that planning point, but Isabel, I think you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in all of these agreements, while we're appointing experts to carry out these different flows of work, for example, the CRO, we do still have to remember that sponsor responsibility and have the right to carry out auditing and to ensure that all of that work is being conducted appropriately.
Yeah, and access to databases, etc. Particularly if you've got issues with a CRO and you need to swap in a new CRO, so just ensuring that you've got the portability of rights, so the trial is not affected. But I think that planning point is absolutely key, and so particularly if we're advising on a large phase 2 or a phase 3 trial, at the outset we're putting timings around this, because we know when we want the trial to start and when we want to start recruiting patients. As Steph said, some of these jurisdictions are going to take longer. I think the US is the obvious example, isn't it, Steph, where you need to just factor in more time to deal particularly with your ICFs, your informed consent forms, and your CTAGs, your clinical trial agreements. Maybe if we start to sort of talk through some of those sort of common contracting themes we are seeing, and maybe if I turn to Steph first of all to lead the way on that.
Yeah, thank you. So the key themes that always get heavily negotiated in my experience outside of the UK are your IP provisions, data privacy provisions, and your liability provisions, because those are quite often the core things where something could go wrong. On IP, you quite often have a tension between the sponsor obviously paying large sums of money to have their drug product investigated, will want to own anything that comes out of it, including any know-how in terms of dosing regime, etc., around the drug. And in contrast to that, the sites that are undertaking the work will want to be able to use as much of the knowledge that they gain from doing the trial in their everyday practice. So you quite often end up having a bit of tension there in terms of what licenses does the sponsor then give to know-how and any kind of intellectual property that is developed at the site, and quite often you exclude anything that relates specifically to the drug. But if it's general know-how that could be useful for treatment of patients, that tends to be uncontroversial. The IP point also plays into the liability provisions, because there might be claims, third-party claims relating to IP infringement that the sites will want to be covered off against, and similarly the sponsor will not want to have to pay for third-party IP infringement claims where the site goes off track, and you quite often come back to your protocol when you're negotiating the liability provisions, particularly around how the drug is used. Have you followed the procedures in the protocol? Because if you haven't followed the procedures in the protocol, you are theoretically in breach of contract, and therefore, why would the sponsor want to pay for liabilities arising out of that? The protocol is also very useful when you're talking about patient injury claims. So sites and CROs actually will want to have some form of indemnification from the sponsor if a study subject suffers an adverse event or serious adverse event as a result of being dosed with the investigational medicinal product. And there's always a little bit of argy-bargy around what happens in relation to injuries through participation in the trial generally, because patients would not be having a blood draw, for example, had they not participated in the study. So generally, you say if it's carried out in accordance with the protocol and you haven't been negligent, the sponsor will pick up the patient injury bill. And then the other bit that also plays into liability but is a biggie is data privacy. Obviously, you're dealing with some fairly sensitive patient information because you will be, depending on which phase you're in, you won't be having healthy volunteers, you will be having volunteers that have the disease area that you're investigating. So you will be collecting information about their health that's fairly sensitive. And there are additional protections under UK and EU GDPR relating to sensitive personal data. And although the sponsor doesn't usually get any identifiable information, it's all key coded, the site will hold the key. You need to be fairly careful about drafting your contractual terms around how the data will be shared. If it goes via the CRO, you'd probably want to have things in there that the CRO won't try to re-identify patients unless it's a legal requirement, for example. But also, if there's a data breach, who is responsible for the liability that might arise out of that? So those are the kind of three areas that I generally focus on in the negotiations.
And maybe just to pick up a few of those themes. I mean, just around IP, you'd probably apply the general principle that there's unlikely to be any sort of valuable sort of patentable invention coming out of the trial because the drug product is pretty locked down. But as Steph said, there may be some stuff around dosing regimens, maybe stuff around formulations as well. But if you're then wanting to sort of patent protect, you need to look at that in the context of the transparency rules around clinical trials, because all of the information needs to be published. And so you've got that interaction between wanting to maybe file a new patent, thinking around the rights of publication under the clinical trial agreement. And so just making sure that all of this sort of merges with your own sort of IP capture procedures and policies, and you're giving yourselves sufficient time to make a filing before publication. So thinking around the timelines around that will be key. In relation to patent infringement, as many of you will know, there are various defences around experimental purposes. Some of the activity here may fall subject to some of those defences at law, but those defences are often fairly tightly constrained, and hence the wish, particularly for investigators and sites, to get the benefit of indemnities. Just picking up on some of those other issues. I mean, under your MSA, I'd be interested in Steph's view of this, but quite often the sponsor is wanting to place some sort of active obligations around the trial on the CRO, particularly around things like patient recruitment, which the CRO will want to sort of pass down to the trial sites. Obviously, no one can sort of guarantee levels of cohort, but you may want some active obligations around sort of endeavors to secure particular levels of cohort, but also sort of thinking around, well, actually, if we don't get up to a particular target, does that have any sort of impact on the overarching trial? So just building in some flexibility around that. I think one of the other issues is around thinking particularly around the MSA, that actually if you have problems further down the line with the CRO, how easy is it going for you to be able to sort of port to another provider? So thinking all the issues around the ability to assign, to innovate the contract, but then thinking around some of the practical issues in terms of passing on authorizations, access to data, to the TMF, etc. And some of these issues, if they've been dealt with at the time, they would inevitably cause delays. So you need to think around sort of the contractual protection around portability. One of the things I think you also mentioned, Steph, is in the context of things like powers of attorney as well, because often those powers of attorney are very broadly defined and give the CRO or another entity very, very broad powers to act on your behalf. You need to think about actually, well, how does that link in then to the MSA? Because under the MSA, the authority is more tightly defined. So it's you may, I mean, quite often what we would maybe then look to do is to put in place a separate side letter or other form of contractual protection to say, well, actually, CRO, we're giving you this power of attorney because you need it, but in relation to sort of acting on that power of attorney, if it's not an authority conferred under the contract, you need to come back and get our consent. So it's thinking about the interplay between some of these other agreements that are needed and other authorities that are needed with the base contracts. Steph, anything else you wanted to add around?
Well, I think the point you made about what happens if you need to end your relationship with the CRO, another point that you need to think about also is what happens with any money that you've given the CRO already, because quite often the way these are set up commercially is that you have to have like a slush fund, for want of a better term, that you give them a milestone payment up front before they do any activities, and they subtract what they have done against that, and when it reaches a certain level you have to top it up. But obviously if you need to end the study for whatever reason, either you're moving to a different CRO or you're pivoting what you're doing, you might have multiple drugs in your pipeline and decide you want to focus on one rather than the other, as well as the orderly wind down if you're fully terminating, and making sure that is done in a way that guarantees patient safety. You also need to think about, can they incur any additional costs in that period? Do they need to come back to you beforehand? Is there an automatic obligation for them to repay you the money, or would you have to send them an invoice for it? Those kind of practical mechanics, if you think about them in advance, can actually then save a lot of heartache further down the line, because we have had clients that have not dealt with that at the MSA stage, and then have had to terminate a particular clinical program, and the CROs haven't voluntarily coughed up the money that they had in their bank accounts that hadn't been spent, or they tried to incur additional costs and subtract it from the balance before sending it back. So that's just another thing to think about.
I think the other thing to be cognizant of is the sort of the nature of the product as well. So by way of example, if you've got an advanced therapy, cell and gene therapy, for example, Note that there is now a new IRIS standard for an ATMP, which isn't massively different from the base template, but that is the sort of the mandated form for an advanced therapy. And again, with advanced therapy, you may have complex procedures around, for example, development of cell cultures within site that you may need to sort of bolt some additional obligations on, and particularly in relation to oversight on the investigator site as well, which you may want to do through a separate agreement. Again, the protocol is going to be your guiding document in terms of thinking around sort of the additional contractual protection that you will need. I mentioned at the beginning that as well as looking at the contracting piece, you obviously and clinical trial regulation per se, you also need to be thinking about broader legal regulation. Steph's talked already quite a bit about data privacy, but I'm keen that we get into the weeds a bit more in relation to sort of key data privacy considerations, and I'll probably turn to Isabel to talk about everything else in that space. So Steph, do you want to sort of just talk around privacy issues in the context of a clinical trial?
Of course. So as some of you on the call who I've worked with before probably know, I'm a slight data privacy geek. I do quite a lot of data privacy work in this space. And particularly if you're dealing with international trials where you have multiple jurisdictions involved, it's worth being aware that within the European Union, for example, not everyone has interpreted the GDPR in exactly the same way. So you might have some conflicting requirements that are placed on sites, as well as you as a sponsor. So if we kind of broadly move around, so UK-based sponsors very clearly will be subject to the UK GDPR. UK GDPR has extraterritorial effect. If someone is processing data on your behalf, they will need to enter into a contract with you that requires them to comply with certain things in the GDPR. The UK has also taken the approach that a sponsor is defined as a controller for data protection purposes, and the site will be a processor in relation to the clinical trials data that they're collecting. They will be a controller in relation to everything else that they do in terms of patient care provision. But that makes the UK really straightforward. So if you're in the UK only, very straightforward templates, deal with it. Your ICF forms will also be fine. When you then move into the European Union, different jurisdictions have interpreted the roles completely differently. So you might end up having multiple different sites in one jurisdiction that follows the same as the UK approach. So you have sponsor as a controller, site as processor. Some jurisdictions say that the site and the controller, the site and the sponsor are joint controllers, which then theoretically requires you to enter into a joint controller arrangement. Some jurisdictions, particularly in Eastern Europe, have the site, the sponsor, and the PI as joint controllers in relation to the clinical trials data. So that all changes what the contractual landscape looks like as between the parties. It also affects your ICFs, because in the UK, sponsor as controller is responsible for making sure you provide the right data privacy information. UK is also very clear that in the context of clinical trials, the legal basis for processing personal data is because it's a requirement for you to undertake clinical trials. So it's not based on consent. So although it's called an informed consent form, for data privacy purposes, you don't use consent as your legal basis. You still need consent for the clinical trial regulation purposes. And other European jurisdictions have said that processing must be on the basis of explicit consent because it concerns health data. So you end up having to be quite smart with the way you draft your informed consent forms, because you might have a tendency in Europe where they want you to refer specifically to the articles on the basis of which you are basing your legal basis. But actually, if you describe it in words, you might be able to tick both the UK GDPR box and the EU GDPR box in terms of what the legal basis is on which you're relying to process that personal data. And then when you move to the US, you have a whole other kettle of fish because you have the HIPAA requirements that the sites will have to comply with, and then you also very frequently end up with a battle with US sites to accept that the UK GDPR or EU GDPR apply to them. You get very robust responses usually at the outset that say, well, we're in the US, we're not subject to GDPR. And you then have to try and explain to them that because you are based in the UK or the European Union as sponsor, you are a controller, and therefore you have to ensure that certain contractual clauses are put in the contract in order for you to be compliant with your own data privacy laws. And that can get you quite far if you try and explain it in that way, and also not referring to the relevant articles in the GDPR can also go quite a long way. So provided you're actually using the language that you need to tick the boxes for GDPR compliance, you're okay from a GDPR perspective, and you can quite often persuade US organizations that that's okay because they're agreeing to a contract. They're not agreeing to submit to the GDPR. So those are some of the data privacy fun and games that we have in international studies. If you go into other jurisdictions, they also have their own data privacy laws that you would need to comply with. We generally try to then work with local counsel if needed. But yeah, EU and UK don't agree. Even within the EU, they don't agree with how the relationships between the parties are set up and the legal basis on which you're processing the data. So factor that into your ICF drafting, factor that into your site contracting, and don't be surprised when someone comes and says, well, actually here in Spain or here in Germany, we have a completely different approach. It just seems to have developed that way, and in the absence of guidance from the European Data Protection Board, it's going to stay that way for a while.
This is all part of the planning process.
Yeah.
In terms of understanding where each of the site in that will sort of guide what you need to be thinking about in relation to.
And it can help if you have some language ready to go. So think about where do you want to be doing your studies, and then work out what language you would need in order to tick your compliance box from a data privacy perspective where you're based, but also, and then try and run that past the local jurisdiction as well if you can, and then just pop it into the relevant documentation rather than having to reinvent the wheel each time.
Yeah, so maybe I'll come to Isabel just in terms of picking up some of those other sort of regulatory issues, broader regulatory issues.
Yeah, there were a couple of things I wanted to focus on. So one issue that we have is around samples of tissue samples, for example, that arise out of the clinical trial. And sometimes clients want to keep a database, a tissue bank of the samples that have arisen, and then they may at some future point want to use them for wider research. Now, the problem here you can come into difficulties with human tissue legislation, and so if that might be a possibility, we would want to encourage clinical trial sponsors to build that into their consenting process at the outset. So all those consent documents that we've been talking about, if you deal with the issue of possibly using it in that way later, then you can head that one off rather than having to seek that additional consent at a later point. And then also around human tissues, if you're in a situation where tissues or cells might be under investigation for application as part of the therapeutic treatment, then you'll be bringing in the quality and safety regulations in the UK and around the EU. So what we'd be, you'd have to build in more stringent requirements for the process of collecting the tissue or cells and then transporting them as necessary, and all of that. You're involving specialist clinicians often, and you'll need agreements that will cover that to comply with that separate legislation that isn't a part of the main clinical trials legislation. One thing we haven't really talked about much is devices. I mean, people will appreciate that medical devices and in vitro diagnostic devices will have their own separate legislative regime around them, and it's not quite as onerous and detailed as all of the stuff that we've been talking about around medicinal products. But again, you'd need to, the manufacturer, who is the responsible entity for the purposes of those regulations, will need to sort of map out who's going to be responsible for what and set up in their agreements, if there is allocated responsibility, deal with who holds that and how it's going to be covered off between them.
Yeah, fantastic. Good. We've started to have some questions coming in, so maybe we can sort of deal with those over the last sort of 10 minutes. And if anyone else has got any questions they want to feed through, then please do that through the Q&A facility. So I think if I sort of just capture those 3 or 4 main questions at the moment, and then pose them to Steph and Isabel. So there's a question here around examples of language for GDPR in different jurisdictions that we can use. I mean, that may ultimately be a bit of a follow-up task, but I'm sure Steph can maybe sort of talk about sort of where should you be looking in terms of identifying some of that language. So that's the first question. Second question was around, which we do see quite often, in relation to DPOs. So particularly if you've got a smaller biotech, you may not have a DPO, and it's sort of thinking through in terms of operating a clinical trial when you sort of you move to that requirement. So that was a question. Clinical investigations, I think there was a question around actually differences there. I think Isabel's covered that, but if there's any other further points to make. And I suppose there's also a point you made towards the beginning, Isabel, in terms of we've got currently a consultation around clinical trial regulation in the UK and where we see that potentially going. So those are sort of the 4 questions. I don't know, in terms of, should we take those in that kind of order?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's usually 1 and 2.
That's fine. So for examples of language, that kind of depends slightly on what it is and where you're going to be. But where I generally start in the contracts is I look at the Article 28 GDPR requirements, which kind of has a bullet list of the obligations that a controller needs to put on a processor. So I would look at whether the contract that you have with your sites or your CRO covers those requirements in terms of what they are doing with the data. The UK IRAS template actually has a really good clause as a starting point that you can use as inspiration for that kind of drafting, because that distinguishes very clearly between the clinical trial activity and the general patient treatment activity of the site. So that's in terms of your CRO or site documents. And then for the informed consent forms, that is the one that is slightly more tricky, because that depends a bit on what it is you're doing, what the procedures are that you're asking the patient to do. Are you going to be collecting any samples for further research purposes? Because you will there have a number of different consents that you have to get in terms of the consent to the treatment, consent to sample collection and storage. And you also then have the data privacy element. So those ones are a bit more nuanced, and there isn't really a default position on that. But very happy to have a conversation offline about that, if that would be helpful. And then with the DPO point that James mentioned, I don't know how familiar everyone else is with GDPR requirements, but if you're going to be undertaking processing on a large scale, particularly in using new technologies or using particularly sensitive data, which health data includes, you might need to appoint a data protection officer as a legal requirement, and they need to be generally accessible by the data subjects whose data you are processing. And there are a number of people who provide DPO services. Some companies specifically set up to do that. Sometimes law firms will be able to offer you a data protection officer service. There's also separately, like with the clinical trial representatives, a data protection representative. If you're not based in the UK and undertaking clinical trials in the UK, you will need to appoint a representative for data protection purposes in the UK. And similarly, in the European Union, you will need to have an authorised representative who will need to be separate to your data protection officer in order to deal with data protection related issues. So if an issue crops up, what will happen is the regulators will go to that authorised representative, and they will act as the interface between you and the regulators. So I hope that answers the question on DPO, and then also thinking about the representatives. One thing to note is data protection officers might need to be notified to the data protection authorities in the jurisdictions in which you are doing your clinical trials. But again, there's no alignment between the different jurisdictions. So the current guidance suggests it's you pick the jurisdiction in which you have the most patients, and you register your DPO, or you notify your DPO contact details to that authority. But I know Greece in particular, they also want to be notified. So as soon as you have any activity in Greece, you need to be thinking about notifying that. But again, probably too much detail for this call.
That's really useful, and I'm sure both Steph and Isabel are happy just to follow up sort of separately as well, and have discussions around a lot of this in terms of your own issues. There are other questions cropping up as well, but before we go to those, anything to add in terms of clinical investigations for medical devices? And I know Isabel, you've addressed it in part, but anything else to add?
Well, I mean, there is a whole separate set of guidance that's really useful, and if you're appointing organisations to support you with your clinical investigation, then you'll want to require them to follow, for example, the international standard on clinical investigations for medical devices. So it is another separate topic, really, but it is becoming tougher, that suite of legislation. We've had the EU reforms that have recently come through, and then the UK is similarly updating its regime, and we are going to expect to see more onerous requirements on the clinical at the moment. The clinical investigation side in the UK is relatively lightly regulated, but that's expected to tighten up in the next wave of changes.
Absolutely, and we will be blogging around all of this as and when the proposals become clearer. There's a couple of other additional questions which hopefully are relatively easy to deal with. So the first question is, does the sponsor still ultimately have responsibility in non-interventional studies, or is it possible for them to delegate this entirely to the CRO? Who'd like
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that the sponsor does still retain responsibility, but there may be a question around who actually is a sponsor in a trial where somebody else wants to take on the role of running the trial. You may get into a question, well, are we in fact co-sponsors? But if you're retaining the role of sponsor, then you would keep those obligations.
Yeah, I mean, you do need to check that the study is a clinical trial as defined by regulation. I think the specific question here is around a non-interventional study. So maybe that actually the full regime doesn't.
Maybe it doesn't engage
so
the full.
It may not even engage in the first place. The next question is the publication of a public assessment report mandatory in the UK?
My understanding is yes, but I would like to check that one.
Yeah, absolutely, we can do that, but that's my understanding as well. Can you comment, and this is probably the final question given time, can you comment on the overlap between the devices regulations and the EU CTR and the impact that is having on sponsors conducting trials that include performance studies as part of the clinical trial? Are you seeing questions raised around this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult area. The clinical, I mean, we do see efforts made to address situations where you have a medicinal product and a device that are being tested in the same context, and the rules are trying to address this, but it's that there is an interplay there. It's fairly complicated, and it would be you want to explore in detail what your exact situation is to work out how that applies.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that planning and understanding the different regulatory responsibilities that are at play here, because you've got different categories of products with potentially different regulatory regimes. The legislation is trying to catch up, address that interplay, but you are effectively needing to understand regulation across different products. Wonderful. I think we're probably there for this morning. So I wanted to thank both Steph and Isabel. It was really insightful. I learned an awful lot this morning as well, which is always great. So the final point, just by way of housekeeping. So Sarah from our marketing team will send you a feedback form. It'd be great for you to fill that in, tell us how we've done, but also there's a box there which allows you to suggest topics for the future. We're just in the midst of confirming our legal forums for next year, and that will go out to everyone on the mailing list fairly shortly in any event. But we're very, very keen to keep this relevant to our clients. So if there are any specific questions or topics that you would like us to address on a future Life Sciences Legal Forum, then please feed that through. But thank you very much for joining today. Hopefully you found that insightful, and we look forward to welcome you to a future legal forum. Thank you.